Welcome to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and along with my co-host, Chris Kaye, we discuss and dissect our favorite music, heavy metal. So sit back, relax, pop open a cold one, and let the debate begin. Welcome back. This is the sophomore episode of Debating Metal. I'm Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co-host Chris Kaye. And today we're going to discuss debut albums. And we're also going to be introducing a new segment called The Big Four. And that's where we discuss our top four of any particular category, like drummers, guitarists, etc.
But before that, we have to acknowledge the passing of the Professor Neil Peart. Fantastic drummer. The drummer for Rush from the album 2 onward, a brilliant lyricist, and a huge loss to the music community.
Oh, that was a gigantic loss. I mean, his influence is felt in everything. When it comes to lyrics, songwriting, the style of songs, his drumming was beyond phenomenal. I mean, widely considered probably the greatest drummer of all time.
He was the favorite of many of our favorites. Just an inspiration and somebody that we sorely missed.
Yep. Rest in peace, Neil. All right, so today we're talking about debut albums. The debut albums from all our favorite heavy metal bands, all from the beginning of metal all the way up to now. So what do you got for us today, Chris?
So we're going to go in chronological order, just to keep it fair, and also kind of tell the history of metal in a strange way. The first would be Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, the album from Black Sabbath. While technically not a metal album, it was the first of the genre, what led to become metal. Although we definitely recognize Led Zeppelin before them as one of the contributors to that sound, but those first notes of the song Black Sabbath, as you first listen to the album, it just the dark tones, just if you imagine yourself in 1970, it'd just be absolutely freaked out.
That's some scary shit.
Yeah. Now that being said, what are your feelings on the song Black Sabbath, Dean?
Well, I'm not a fan. Unfortunately, I love the album. I'm not a big fan of the song Black Sabbath itself. It's not because it's a creepy song, because it's extremely creepy. But and you think about it, in 1970, that is probably the creepiest thing you could probably listen to. But it's too slow for me. It kind of drones on, in my opinion. Not a big fan of the song. Rest of the album, N.I.B., Wizard, Evil Woman, that was actually added later on. Actually, there was a single.
Well, Evil Woman was on the original European release.
Was it?
Yes, but it wasn't on the U.S. release, which is a subject we'll talk about at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and then, so it had its fair share of great songs on it. It's just not Black Sabbath, the song itself is not my favorite.
See, for me, it's the opposite. Black Sabbath was that song that it kind of scared me into liking it, because up to that point, there wasn't a lot of heavy music that I listened to, and I would say I probably listened to that well before I listened to Metallica. My family was never very religious, but at the same time, they came from a religious background. My grandfather was a Church of Christ minister, so when I got my hands on heavier stuff, it was kind of secretive to me, and me listening in the closet to Black Sabbath was a little scary.
That's got to be weird. Being in the closet with Black Sabbath?
Yeah, no pun intended.
No.
But no, the songs he mentioned, all fantastic. It's more of a bluesy album, but it definitely was the predecessor to what would become metal music.
Right, exactly. Also that year, just a brief mention, UFO came out with their first album, UFO. It did not contain Michael Schenker as a guitar player. That didn't come for another couple of years until their second album, or actually their third album, Phenomenon. It was lights out for UFO at that point. Our next album, what we're going to talk about?
1974, Kiss.
Kiss. Well, Kiss is near and dear to my heart, isn't it? Yeah. The first album from Kiss was, in terms of sales, didn't go anywhere. It literally stalled, but it had a ton of promise. I mean, to this day, they still play 6-7 songs from that album. You know, they're all classics. I mean, if you think about it, they had, you know, Strutter, Cold Gin, Firehouse, Deuce, Black Diamond, 100,000 Years. All those songs were on that first album.
And some of those have been re-recorded since.
They re-recorded a bunch.
Yeah,
because it's all copyright law. You know, certain bands, especially with the advent of the internet and streaming, certain bands wanted to get their rights back on their songs, so they re-recorded them. I mean, Def Leppard painstakingly recorded their hit singles because they didn't have a deal with iTunes or any of the streaming services, but they wanted to have some sort of way to make money off of those songs because they weren't in control of them. So they took those songs, got control of them, and then released them. And then shortly thereafter, they made a deal with all the streaming services.
That's such an unfortunate thing when the guys that created the music don't even control it.
Yeah, it's terrible. And there are very few bands, Motley Crue, Metallica, that I know of, are the only two major bands that have full 100% control of their music.
Metal bands. Because we're all aware of you know, some of the pop bands that have had the same problem in the recent years that have fought to, you know, secure the rights of their music in bizarre ways sometimes because they have to.
Yeah,
it's really sad
for sure. So Kiss's first album came out in 1974. Didn't do very well. They went back into the studio later that year for their second album. What else came out in that time?
In 74, we also had the first release from Judas Priest. Not really a metal album. This was a lot of holdover songs from the Al Atkins era of the band before recording. It was more of a hard rock psychedelic album. It's kind of a hard listen if you came into the band later, like I did with British Steel. But it's definitely the groundwork of what they would become later as you listen in progression. But if you were to take British Steel and then immediately go and listen to Rock'n'Rolla, it'd be kind of a tough sell.
Yeah, Rock'n'Rolla, it had, I mean, the song itself, Rock'n'Rolla, is pretty cool. Really, the rest of the album doesn't have a lot of what would be Judas Priest later on.
And the album was re-released as Hero Hero. Had
a couple of the songs, like half the album was done as Hero Hero.
Yeah, it was a mixture.
There's a little bit harder edge to it, but still, I mean, Never Satisfied ended up being a very influential song for a lot of bands, especially with the acoustic movement as it came along in the 2000s. A lot of bands were covering that song. Armored Saint was one of those particular bands. Let's move on to the next one. That would be 1975 with Rainbow.
Richie Blackmore's Rainbow was the first release after he left Deep Purple. Deep Purple, probably a band we should mention as well, but up to that point,
that year.
up to that point, it was not really a metal band either.
No, they weren't.
It's classified, Richie Blackmore's Rainbow is classified as a metal album, but still has a lot of that Renaissance feel that he would carry on throughout his career. A little bit slower, more hard rock. You can definitely tell a huge progression from the first album to the second album of more of the metal sound. What it did bring to us was to mainstream music was Ronnie James Dio.
Yes.
His really first album didn't really become as big of a hit in America until he joined Black Sabbath a few years later. Definitely brought him to attention. Rainbow really didn't become anything in America until later when
Joe Lynn
Turner joined the band.
Yeah, they tried to do something when they had Graham Bonnet as a singer. When that kind of almost broke them.
It just didn't really break them.
Right, the Down to Earth album was a good album, but it didn't go over very well. But Joe Lynn Turner and I Surrender was the single, I think that broke Rainbow in the States.
Yes,
and eventually the Straight Between the Eyes album was what.
Yeah, you had Death Valley Driver or Death Alley Driver.
Death Alley Driver, and Stone Cold was the big hit for them.
Yes. So following 1975, we have 1976 AC/DC's first album, but it was kind of an odd release as it was an Australia-only version of High Voltage.
Right, and that actually, the Australian version actually came out in 1975. But in 1976, the album came out in America.
Okay.
But oddly enough, the album that came out in America in 76 was AC/DC's second album, TNT, in Australia. It was a
couple flipped songs between the
those
two
American
albums.
companies like to do and change songs around.
And what we would call jailbreak later.
Right, and so later on, the songs that didn't make it would come out on 74 Jailbreak back in, I think it was 1984. It finally came out.
Mm-hmm.
So
AC/DC, well after Bond's death.
Oh, yeah, well after Bond's death. I mean, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap came out after Bond's death in the United States.
Yeah.
It was already a well-known album all around the world. And, the American record companies sometimes just don't get it. And that's things like that happen to AC/DC happen. But AC/DC's first American album was High Voltage. Contains a few classics, especially It's a Long Way to the Top. If you want to rock and roll, that's the big hit off of there.
Featured in Jack Black's movie School of Rock.
That's an awesome movie, especially if you like music. And also on that album was Live Wire. TNT. That's also a good song. So there was a lot that showed a lot of promise. And eventually, the next album actually that they recorded would be Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, which Americans didn't hear for quite a while. It wasn't until Let There Be Rock that America really got a big hit on AC/DC. So moving right along,
we get Van Halen.
The mighty Van Halen.
They're Running with the Devil, Eruption. Already mind blown at
Eruption.
that point.
Yeah, Eruption says it all. I mean, there was tons and tons of people just walking around with their jaws on the floor. A bunch of young kids that played guitar.
Just drool everywhere.
Yeah, just drool everywhere. That album was phenomenal.
I mean, my personal favorite is Ain't Talking About Love. There's just something about that just explosion of music that was happening in that whole album from beginning to end. Even Ice Cream Man, was a good finish to the album. If you had that version of the album, if you had a cassette tape, sometimes On Fire was the last song, which was intended to be the final song. However, Ice Cream Man was on some versions because for some reason On Fire became track 6.
What happened to the other 5 tracks? No, so
the other 5 that was side A.
Was this something that was added to it? Like
no,
it
was just a misprinted.
Release? Oh, it was a misprint.
Yeah, it was just a made release.
Oh, okay, so
yeah.
the manufacturing issue.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, that's cool. So there's probably like a lot of collector's items out there.
I think it was like a 50-50 split on which version of the cassette you got.
Oh,
and nobody really collects cassettes anymore.
Cassettes.
I'm sorry to the one person that still collects cassettes and is
I'm buying a Sony Walkman next week just for that. All right, so Van Halen's first album, was groundbreaking. The
Absolutely.
Guitar work was incredible. My personal favorite happens to be Van Halen 2, which is just the album I bought by accident thinking it was the first album. And I'm like, where's Eruption? How come I don't hear Eruption? All I got is this acoustic Spanish Fly. I'm serious. That's what happened to me. I put on the thing. I was like, I hear Spanish Fly. I'm like, well, this is pretty cool, but what happened to Eruption? I thought it was this big guitar thing, and nope, it wasn't there. But I like the album. Damn, it's a good album. Van Halen 2.
Sophomore albums are
sophomore
subject
album.
For another day.
That's another day. All right, so after Van Halen in 78,
all aboard!
The Crazy Train, Ozzy Osbourne, came out in 1980. So he gets fired from Black Sabbath in 79.
For the second time.
For the second, third, fourth time.
I walked away, fired. It's kind of a murky area.
Yeah.
He was fired the second time for sure.
Yeah, they parted ways.
Mm-hmm.
He stayed drunk in a hotel room for quite a long time. Actually, his new video references that whole thing about him being...
for his new album?
Yeah, for a new album. All right, so Blizzard of Oz comes out in 1980. So much like Van Halen had Jaws drop to the floor, Randy Rhoads was introduced to the world because even though he was on the first 2 Quiet Riot records, nobody except for some Japanese people on the other side of the world knew about that.
Yeah, it was very limited releases in Japan and never really
and the production
shown
wasn't
to
as
the
good.
world. Yeah.
Songs weren't as good, but Ozzy released or unleashed Randy Rhoads world. And
For 2 albums, two
Wow.
amazing albums.
yes, amazing. Randy Rhoads is my favorite guitar player, hands down. Even though Van Halen had a lot of tricks, he had the finger tapping. Randy Rhoads, I mean, if you listen to those first 2 albums, if you listen to Blizzard, you listen to Diary, the production that he did, getting hit, because they produced it, they basically self-produced the first album, and to listen to Crazy Train and the overlapping, I mean, the guy overdubbed his guitars and tracked them and double tracked them and triple tracked them to precision with different tones. I mean, the production alone on Blizzard of Oz is amazing.
Yeah, he broke a lot of ground. It's hard not to. I mean, when you say he's your favorite guitarist, it's hard not to have him up there. I mean, he really only had 2 major albums to showcase his work, and every song was a hit.
Oh, his work is incredible.
It really was. Yeah, absolutely. Blizzard of Oz is one of those albums that it was a really defining moment for Ozzy, because what could he do outside of Black Sabbath? He wasn't a songwriter. He wasn't one of the major components of this the songwriting itself was in Black Sabbath, but he was the voice. He was that dark and creepy aspect of it.
He was the melody
and he was
maker.
the showman.
Right. Yeah, he's the front man. He's one of the greatest front men of all time.
Mm-hmm.
But this album, with Bob Daisley on bass, Randy on guitar, Lee Kerslake on drums, 4 of them wrote the songs. The 4 of them produced the album. And that album was amazing.
Absolutely.
And as amazing as that was, their sophomore record was probably better. But that's for another episode.
Debatable.
It's debatable. There have been plenty of debates. Jericho has done a album-to-album, head-to-head debate on that. So that's for another episode for us to discuss.
We'll be definitely doing that.
That's for sure. All right. Also in 1980, a favorite of ours came out.
Iron Maiden. Such a great album. First Paul Di'Anno album. Just groundbreaking in the sound that was produced. You could hear every instrument. You could hear the bass, which became a staple of metal for the next 10 years, was that differentiation of sound. You could hear all the parts. The bass was so important that it's kind of muddy today.
Yeah.
Whereas, the driving force, the galloping bass of Steve Harris.
And what's funny is Steve hates the album. He thinks the production stinks on it. That's why, Will Malone was the producer on that album. And the second album, again, another sophomore effort, is when they introduced Martin Birch to the band, and he became their producer all the way up until he retired.
Well, definitely better production on the second album.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a no-brainer.
But the songs
themselves.
On Iron Maiden were incredible. Incredible. And my favorite being Phantom on that album. Phantom of the Opera.
Phantom of the Opera, Iron Maiden, Prowler. I mean, just so good songs.
Awesome album. Okay. What else we got as far as the 80s are concerned?
1982, we got Merciful Fate.
Merciful Fate.
Melissa.
That's an interesting album, because you're talking about a Danish band no one knows of, and they basically pioneer a whole metal movement, a genre that ended up being black metal, death metal, whatever. It splintered in so many different ways. Venom was a purveyor the year before. Merciful Fate came out. What was it? Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, all those guys came out around the same time.
1984.
Yeah. So in 82, Merciful Fate comes out with Melissa, and you hear this guy who has a falsetto that's just unbelievable.
And his ability to switch between a falsetto and a little bit of not a growl, but a little bit of a gruff singing voice.
Right.
His ability to just swap back and forth is uncanny.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he had an amazing skill. And then, on top of that, what would eventually be a black metal staple, he wore the kabuki makeup, make himself look evil.
The corpse paint.
Right.
Well, and the subject matter of the music, the satanic nature of the music, became almost cool, and from a mythological standpoint. You know, it just telling a story of, you know, the fall of Satan, the witches, Melissa,
right,
the character. It's all just it's very interesting to listen to because it's a lot of storytelling.
Yeah, he's definitely a great storyteller, and that would come out later, much later, when he became King Diamond, the band, as opposed to the singer. But Melissa, I mean, there's some classic songs on there with Evil, The Curse of the Pharaohs, Into the Coven, Satan's Fall, all those albums. Oh, excuse me, all those songs.
You just list the whole.
Yeah, I mean, there's only 8 songs in the album, so but a classic album. Also,
1983. Nothing happened.
Nothing happened whatsoever in 1983, other than
Metallica Kill 'Em All.
A worldwide movement began in 1983. Metallica unleashed Kill 'Em All on the unsuspecting public in New Jersey. in a record store called Rock and Roll Heaven. It was amazing. I mean, Metallica was building their name with their underground tape trading. Johnny Z hears about them, brings them to New York. They record their debut album. This comes out in June, I believe, of 1983. And the doors got smashed open. Kill 'Em All. What do you have to say?
I mean, Kill 'Em All was new and different to the ears of the public. Most people hadn't heard Diamond Head. Most people hadn't heard a lot of the influences that they had heard, like Budgie, etc. So it was the culmination of all these things together that formed something that appealed to just so many people. And it was the origins of thrash metal. You know, songs like Whiplash. Just there hadn't been anything really quite like it yet.
Oh, no. I mean, even when I first heard Whiplash, I mean, that's the first Metallica song I ever heard. And I was already a quote-unquote metalhead, but I was listening to, you know, Van Halen, Judas Priest, Ozzy, AC/DC, but Metallica was just different. And the first time I heard Whiplash, I was like, I didn't think people could play that fast. I mean,
Motorhead had songs before that.
I hadn't even heard Motorhead.
But Motorhead, was not as widely spread either.
No, but Metallica it was just
at
something
least in the US.
Different, right? In the U.S., Metallica was different. It was a movement because it wasn't just Metallica. I mean,
it was raw. It was emotional. It was angry, and it was all these things that people were feeling at the time.
And the sound of the album, it literally sounded like a buzzsaw. You know, for whatever one reason, like some sort of woodworking machine pushing a board of, you know, a pile of wood through it and just cutting it. That's the way the guitar sounded. They sounded so just rough, but it was such a clean sound. It was incredible. That's all I can say. I mean, I was floored.
Just attack, yeah.
Yeah, it was straight on attack. And in '83, later that year, Slayer would come out with Show No Mercy. And although not as produced as well, just as influential. I mean, that whole scene became, you know, although they were always a thrash band, Slayer, they would be what would become the, I guess, speed metal.
They carried the banner of thrash with Anthrax for the last...
right, but you know, they were part of, you know, somewhere on a tangential side of black metal, of death metal, because of their vocal style and because of their
subject matter.
And the subject matter. Yeah. You know, along with that, so basically Metallica in '83, Slayer in '83, and at the same time, although they weren't signed, Anthrax was around at that time because they became friends with Metallica. They come out with their album in 1984.
With Neil Turbin as the singer
on vocals.
A little different, not as widely appreciated. Eddie Trunk is known for kind of mentioning to Anthrax that he thought they sounded awesome, but didn't think they were going to get anywhere with Neil as the singer. And it's probably true. I mean, when Joey Belladonna joined the scene, it changed the game for them.
They became the heavy metal Journey.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean,
that's kind of what I've said before. Yeah,
right.
They have a Journey-esque vocal sound past that initial album that made them a little bit more accessible to the early metal people.
Yeah,
fans.
Yeah, but Neil's. I mean, that first album, Fistful of Metal. I always I like the way Bush re-recorded some of those songs.
Mm-hmm.
They sound really good. The production was much better, but there was just something special about Fistful of Metal when it first came out.
There's some really cool songs for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, it was definitely early thrash,
Yes, definitely early thrash.
which
And then to go along with that, to add to that, 1985, here comes
Megadeth.
You know, fresh off of the bus back from New York.
Who already sort of had a debut in a way in songwriting credits with
Right, with
Metallica's
Metallica,
first
yeah.
album. But, you know, the record companies knew Dave was really talented. They gave him a stipend to start the album. He blew all the money on you know, extracurriculars. And
Sorry.
and then they realized they had to throw an album together pretty quick. So the first album has some fantastic songs on it. It's not necessarily as cohesive.
It's
as
got
what
great
followed.
songs on it, but man, does that album sound like shit.
Well, I mean, it's also been remastered a couple times and does sound better today. The unfortunate thing is
he
these boots has
re-recorded
been
some of-
re-recorded
Oh, yeah.
because of copyright issues, and yeah, unfortunately, you got to listen to that original version of these boots to really get what was intended.
I think on the Final Kill version,
He's also re-recorded some guitar parts.
He re-recorded
and vocals.
Well, on the so there was the reissue of Kill 'Em All of
The 90s reissue you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about the 2004. I think it was.
Yeah, okay, 2004. Yeah,
That one there was parts re-recorded. That's when they beeped out the lyrics to that he
the
changed
terrible
to these
version.
boots. But then when they came out with another one a couple years ago, he re-recorded the things again.
yes.
And this
Each
time
time, like
he
Star
actually
Wars.
straightened out the lyrics to these boots so that he can get it without the beeps on it.
Mm-hmm.
So-
But they're new lyrics.
They're new
They're
lyrics.
not. They're
It's-
not the same original
Right.
lyrics. So
So-
you got 3 versions of the songs.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's
Yep.
weird. I mean, it sounds great, but you go all the way back to the first one where they had the album cover they didn't want, the sound they didn't want. I mean, it was a total cluster mess for Dave, but a lot of that had to do with his own personal issues at the time.
Yeah, and which is a catalog of history.
But again, his second album, The Sophomore, would change things.
Yep.
Sophomore albums coming soon.
So going back to 1984, we kind of touched on Hellhammer, Bathory. Those two were really the first black metal albums. Still a little different than what it would become.
Right.
But at that point, it was the low production, fighting against what was accepted as the death metal scene, not really death metal scene, but the extreme metal scene, the overproduction, the people in Sweden, Finland, Norway, they just really were against the establishment, kind of like punk, in that they just didn't want all that overproduction. It was all more about the mood, the vibe, and these guys, Bathory, Hellhammer, which became Celtic Frost later, were the predecessors following Venom on that dark, black, evil sound.
What I don't understand about that is that Celtic Frost themselves actually had good production. Tom Fisher actually wants good production.
Well, that was why he went away from Hellhammer.
Right.
The Hellhammer was one release. That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was of the black metal vein.
Right. It's just
Yeah.
I never understood and will still not understand why it is that genre prefers to sound like crap, because they've got such talent in a lot of those musicians, and it's just
Especially the drummers.
Oh yeah, the drummers are out of their minds. But
because it's about the attitude. It's not just the music, it's the whole presentation that you're getting, and it's an anti-establishment movement, and that's what it's about. I mean, I'm not a big fan of black metal myself, but I understand what story they're trying to tell with their music.
I get it, but I don't like it. So anyway, 1984, 85, we move along to
87.
1987, and there's only one thing we could say about 1987.
Welcome
Do you
to
know
the
where
jungle.
you are? You're in the jungle, baby. Guns N' Roses comes out in 1987, and in reality, no one noticed because the album didn't take off right away. It wasn't until MTV blew up Welcome to the Jungle, and then Sweet Child of Mine became a big hit in early '88. But Appetite for Destruction was basically the epitome of the Sunset Strip scene as it became.
For sure. Of all those bands, Faster Pussycat,
LA Guns.
LA Guns.
All that. Everything that started in the early 80s with Rat, Motley Crue, Wasp, all those bands, it culminated with Guns N' Roses. And they literally took every best piece of that and put it together in Appetite for Destruction.
They did, but they didn't really carry. I mean, they had elements of glam, but they were much meaner.
Oh yeah,
and the result was a much more aggressive album. It was no like I'm gonna love you, baby. It was like I'm gonna love you, and you're gonna like it.
Yeah. I mean, except for Sweet Child of Mine. I mean, that's
there's always
a beautiful song.
Yeah, there's always a ballad in there, but still, I mean,
when you think about the song "Think About You" right before Sweet Child of Mine, I think it's before.
Or "It's So Easy."
Well, yeah,
it's so easy. they're not friendly songs.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, My Michelle,
Night Train.
It's all great songs. Just that album. They still live off of that album to this day. Obviously,
They're still their best one.
Yeah, I mean,
even Matt Sorum said, comparing Appetite for Destruction versus Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, he said Appetite was better.
No, for sure.
He would have rather been on that album.
Who wouldn't? You get a lot of money off of that. So 87 also brought us something near and dear to Chris's heart.
It's the origin of death metal with Death's first album, Scream Bloody Gore. Very different than what they would become, but that first album, very macabre, dark, deathy lyrics. But it was the first, that growl that at first appeared. Celtic Frost had kind of done gruff vocals before. Others had done the same thing, but the first one that did that death growl was Chuck Schuldiner with Scream Bloody Gore.
I don't get it.
Oh, I do. Absolutely.
It's not that I don't get it. I get it, but it was one thing I could not get into. I grew up in the era of the operatic singers. I grew up in the era of, Rob Halford, Bruce Dickinson, Jeff Tate, Ronnie James Dio. Those were singers. And all of a sudden, James Hetfield, not the best singer. Kerry King, not the best singer. But yet
Kerry King.
I'm sorry, not
Tom
Kerry
Araya.
King. Tom Araya. I'm talking about Slayer. Tom Araya, not the best singer. James is not the best singer, but they fit their bands perfectly. But death and death metal, it
took it to the next level.
It's somewhere that I just couldn't grasp it. I don't care about the subject matter because the subject matter is the same as Slayer. Subject matter is the same as Celtic Frost or Merciful Fate. It doesn't bother me subject matter wise. It just I can't adopt that or accept that style of vocals, which is weird because I like Sepultura, I like Amon Amarth. For whatever reason, that real extreme part of Death, the band, I just could not get into.
I think for me it was a natural progression. Everything that I wanted to listen to became heavier and heavier and heavier, and it was just the next logical step. And then lyrically, those first couple albums, they're a little more, zombies and monster movie kind of stuff. But over time,
ahead of his time, really.
Yeah,
because that shit's popular now.
Oh yeah, for sure. But then they changed over time. But we're talking about the debut album, and that's where Death started. Was that kind of zombie ritual?
Was it Scream Bloody Gore?
Scream Bloody Gore.
Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't my thing, and it's still not my thing to this day. Although oddly enough, I like other bands that sound similar.
That they inspired.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and that's kind of how I always felt about Kiss was I never really got Kiss as a whole, but I recognize all the things they inspired and how many artists they inspired, and I've always found them very interesting. Whereas I didn't really grow up listening to their music. In 1990, though, we have Pantera. So we've gone from the era of the beginnings of thrash into more groove metal with Pantera's, not technically their debut, because their debut was Metal Magic. Metal Magic was a whole different band in a way.
It was terrible.
Well, instead of Rex Brown, you had Rex Rocker. Instead of Dimebag Darrell, you had Diamond Darrell.
I was kind of upset when he changed his name to Dimebag. I just didn't want. I didn't like the connotation that it brought, because obviously that's what it meant.
Well, I mean,
but
it is what it is.
On Cowboys from Hell, he was Diamond Darrell. But I guess I don't know if it was a matter of
it was still the
it.
evolution of
Right. I don't know if maybe David Lee Roth said, hey, you can't be Diamond.
I think Diamond just didn't fit with the image of everything from Cowboys and from Hell on. It just didn't fit with that image. Metal Magic, again, was produced by Jerry Abbott,
his dad.
And he actually produced everything from that album to the first Phil Anselmo album, which was power metal. But they were still, a glam metal band up until that point. So most people weren't even aware of those albums because they weren't widely distributed in the U.S. They were in the U.S., but they just weren't widely distributed.
Yeah, they weren't distributed because they were all self-produced. But funny thing about that is on the remastered, the anniversary edition of Cowboys,
which sounds terrible.
Yeah, it's almost unlistenable. They released a song, "I Will Survive," if I'm not mistaken, or "Will to Survive," I think is the song, and that is so reminiscent of what was on power metal.
Mm-hmm. Well, power metal had elements of what would be later. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was Phil Anselmo, but it was Phil Anselmo singing in the higher register, and you'd still have some of that in Cowboys from Hell, but because Cowboys still wasn't what would become later with Vulgar Display of Power, etc. Most people would consider Cowboys from Hell the debut album, even though it's the fifth album from Pantera.
The first four albums really, don't count. I mean, it's hard to say that because they made them, but they never played them again. Mm-hmm. The songs were never played in concert.
Yeah, they were essentially a different band at that point.
Yeah, completely different band.
And it's like I said before, it's the first groove metal band. So that style would carry over. Even if you listen to some of Metallica's stuff that came after, the Black Album had elements of groove in it that they were inspired by guys they inspired.
Yes.
So very interesting.
And the song I was trying to refer to was "The Will to Survive." That came out on the 20th anniversary edition of Cowboys from Hell, and that song you could totally tell is a power metal cast off or leftover or something. And
I would say, this is just personal opinion maybe, but it seemed to me that Cowboys from Hell was kind of introduced by the grunge movement. Certain aspects of the way they sounded was coming off of these grunge bands. Yeah,
to a degree. 1990.
But they were meaner.
Yeah, 1990 changed a lot of things. Much like how 1970, 69 to 70, hard rock and heavy metal was forming. 1980, heavy metal is formed. It's ready to go. It turns into the new wave of British heavy metal. It turns into American thrash metal. And then, the what would now be known as the hair metal phase. 1990 changed all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And Pantera being the last, even though the last of the real heavy bands that come out, they were the first of the newer generation of bands. I was going to try to say genre, but it's the new generation of bands that would essentially form their careers in the 90s. Grunge with Soundgarden, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains. Soundgarden and Alice in Chains being the heavier, where Nirvana and Pearl Jam being more of the mainstream. Pantera went right along with them. Metallica went right along with them. Skid Row's second album, sophomore effort, Slave to the Grind, very heavy album. So that
it was heavy, but I don't feel like it was grungy.
No, it wasn't grungy. I was saying they went long. They didn't go with them per se, but they were all riding the wave together. Metallica did their metal thing, and they, Megadeth did their metal thing, in the 90s, rode their wave, but the grunge movement it was almost like the waves were crossing, especially with Soundgarden and Alice in Chains.
Certain the vibe of music had changed.
Well, actually, in the 80s, a music genre began, or the late 70s, early 80s, which was called hip hop, rap music. Okay, and as a music person, I liked some of the elements of rap. You had the big crossover bands with Run DMC, and LL Cool J, and Public Enemy. But then in 1992, something that I always wanted to have happen was, what happens when you mix rap with metal, or something to that effect? 1992 introduced that in a form of Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah, I mean, Scott Ian himself said that he believes Rage Against the Machine was the first band that really did the rap crossover. Mm-hmm. They were the innovators of the rap rock. The other bands had done, some stuff like Cypress Hill had sampled some rock music. Run DMC did the same thing. Mm-hmm. They did Rockbox. Mm-hmm. Very cool song. They had a guitar solo in it, etc. Mm-hmm. But the first ones that really brought in that politically charged rap album or rap rock album with just killer guitar music was Rage Against the Machine with their debut album Rage Against the Machine. Yes. I mean, just right off the block, you got Bomb Track, and then Killing in the Name. And Killing in the Name, I mean, is just huge. Even people that don't like rap rock know Killing in the Name.
Yeah, I mean, that was the first album to really blend it solid. I mean, a whole album, a whole band, a whole art form, basically. I mean, Anthrax and Public Enemy had joined forces to re-record Bring the Noise, but in reality, that was a one-off, mm-hmm. and it was basically just the same song that had been done earlier, just done with metal, guitars, drums, and bass. Rage Against the Machine, that first album was phenomenal. With those songs, Bomb Track, like you said, Killing in the Name of Freedom was a great
Freedom,
song.
Yeah, for sure. Bullet in the Head.
Bullet in the Head. Those, I mean, the politicalness, which is definitely traces its history to like a Public Enemy and a band like that, and then to have, the guitar work, the bass work. I mean, they just tell you straight up on the album, nothing else other than drums, guitar, vocals, and bass. That was it. There was nothing else. There was no keyboards, nothing. And it's amazing to hear that guitar work.
Tom Morello just did something different than what anybody else was doing at the time. And what followed with rap rock became a little more questionable. I mean, it happens with any genre of music. When you have somebody new and innovative, you have a bunch of copycats. But the originators of that style still have the best guitar tone.
Oh yeah,
in that style.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, Tom's solos are incredible.
Incredible.
He is one of the top tier guitar players in the world. I mean, the guy plays with Bruce Springsteen. So that tells you how much, because Bruce doesn't have crappy musicians on his stage, and you got to play for 4 hours, and you got to know like every song in history when you play with Bruce, because he'll just say, "Hey, let's play this one," boom, and you got to play it. Mm-hmm. So, or either go along with it really well.
Something interesting for nerds out there. Tom Morello actually appeared in a few episodes of Star Trek.
Really?
Yes, he did.
Wow. As what?
He was some kind of alien.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. That for nerds. Well, he is a nerd. I mean, he went to Harvard.
He's absolutely nerd.
He went to Harvard. The guy's smart.
very intelligent. I mean, had a political career, worked for a senator, I believe, at
Did he
one
really?
point. Yes, he did.
Wow.
I'll have
Okay.
to fact check what position this political person.
He wasn't under the desk or anything, was he?
No.
Okay. 1994. Korn. You're not a big fan of Korn.
It's as you said earlier, near and dear to my heart. This is as far away from near and dear to my heart as it gets. Korn and Marilyn Manson.
I'm only mentioning that because they were two bands. You say Marilyn Manson and Korn. Korn was the beginning of new metal.
No doubt the impact that they made. It's just a bad impact.
Oh, I mean, it changed the scene dramatically. And there's no doubt about it. Their influence is still felt today. So, you cannot deny them their place in hard rock, heavy metal history. That being said, I'm not a big fan. I mean, I like some of the songs that are on the radio. Twisted Transistor is a pretty cool song. Some of the stuff on the first album was pretty cool. I actually got to meet them during their first album tour. They signed my first CD, or their first CD, excuse me. But it again, there's no denying their place in history. They came out in 1984. Marilyn Manson came out in 1994. He was a Florida product. I actually was at his album party when the album came out and was released in Fort Lauderdale. Well, released nationally, but the party was in Fort Lauderdale. I don't believe he was there, but I think some of the band members were there. He may have been there just in the back room. The album was an extension of what Nine Inch Nails and Trent Reznor has started a few years earlier. Trent Reznor had a lot to do with the making of this album. So that Portrait of American Family is the debut album for Marilyn Manson. A lot of good songs, a lot of crazy stuff on that album, but it definitely was something that started a whole new genre in the 90s along
shock rock.
Not that Kiss was the first. Well, Alice Cooper.
Cooper,
shock rock.
Kiss. I mean, other
rock.
people had done shock rock, but this was a reinvention of shock rock.
Yeah.
In
an
a
extreme,
explosive manner.
Yeah. Exactly. So also
took full advantage of that parental advisory sticker.
Yeah, he went a little bit beyond in some cases. Also in 94, somewhere on the other side of the world.
You got In Flames. In Flames' first album is kind of an odd one because a lot of the band members that would be in the band every album going forward were not there. It was more of a musical project for Jesper Schramblad, the guitarist, just kind of an outlet for him to create some of these songs he'd been coming up with that really didn't fit into the genre of other stuff that was going on at the time. The singer on the first album is Michael Stan, and I apologize if I mispronounce his last name, but he would become the singer of Dark Tranquillity, and Dark Tranquillity's lead singer Anders Frieden would come over to In Flames, so they swapped places on their next albums.
That's weird,
but it's kind of odd, and the lineup changed with their band too, of people changing instruments, etc. So it was a very cool album that people were very shocked by. It was created what was called the Gothenburg sound, and it had a lot of elements in it of kind of folk music, for at least Swedish folk music.
Swedish folk music's heavy stuff.
Yeah. One of their biggest hits from that album was Behind Space, which was later re-recorded multiple times with the band, and just it's still played today in concert, even though there's very few members of that band. In fact, there's 0 members of the original band on tour now.
But that's actually, since you bring that up, that is going to be another topic that we're going to talk about when we talk about bands and members and how some
changing
don't have
of the guard.
Yeah, some don't have all but one original member. In some cases, none.
None of the original members. Yeah,
which is weird.
Yeah, there are 0 members of the original lineup of In Flames on their current lineup.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So middle 90s was a basically transitional period that eventually would lead into the late 90s. Nu metal was gaining more and more ground at this time. And
In
also,
Finland,
on the other side of the world again.
You had Children of Bottom with their first album, Something Wild. What was kind of unique about that album was it was symphonic. It had keyboard solos. It had guitar solos and keyboard solos trading off, and what you had was more of like a orchestral sound. Mm-hmm. It was released to universal acclaim. There was one thing that has been said about it multiple times by multiple reviewers is that there's no fillers in that album. From beginning to end, it's just hit after hit. And it may not have been a hit in America in the same regard, but overseas, I mean, it was huge. And in Japan, it blew up.
Yeah, Japan likes a lot of different music, and metal, for whatever reason, no matter what kind of style, is near and dear to most Japanese people's hearts. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, they literally adopt everything, and you can be huge in that country, which is pretty cool.
Well, Mr. Big. I mean, Mr. Big is one of those bands that never really had a huge mainstream appeal here, but over in Japan, Mr. Big is gigantic. Mr. Big,
right? Sort of like how the Hoff is huge in Germany.
Yes, I would say a similar aspect.
And he's making a metal album, or did he already make it? Who knows? We'll talk about
that at some point.
Debut album from the Hoff. So in '97, that led to a lot of bands coming out that would eventually all make Ozfest. You got bands like Godsmack, System of a Down, Static X. Slipknot would come out in the late 90s. Drowning Pool, no, they were later.
Not really my scene, but
and it was funny because, a lot of them got lumped into nu metal. And they really weren't nu metal. I would never consider Godsmack a nu metal band. I would never consider Slipknot a nu metal band because if you listen to the first song called Sick, there are elements on that song.
Sick from what band?
From Slipknot.
Okay.
You hear there's elements that are very deathy. Not that it's death metal at all, but very deathy. Obviously the vocals, extreme, almost deathy, but my wife was telling me last night, we heard one song and she instantly identified it as Slipknot. And she says to me, there's no denying that sound. No matter where you hear it, how you hear it, you can identify the fact that it's Slipknot and that it's Corey Taylor singing, even with the rough vocals. It's uncanny, and that's great. That's what makes a great album. That's what makes a great song. That's what makes a great band, when you have your own unique style. So Slipknot's first album came out in '99. Very good album for the genre that it would continue to help explode. The whole Ozfest era of bands, basically what ended up becoming the new wave of American heavy metal, which essentially is metalcore. Not necessarily my favorite thing, but there are some bands. I'm a big fan of Shadows Fall. They really had some cool albums, some cool songs. I almost look like that they combined a lot of elements of like traditional American heavy metal, like Metallica or the stuff from the 80s, and then mixed it with the growling vocals and then clean vocals, which is that metalcore.
There's elements of the Scandinavian sound and some of those bands' music, yeah.
So that became metalcore, and that genre. We're not going to touch upon that tonight because it just extends into so many little different tentacles and branches somewhere else. And we'll have a discussion about that when we can intelligently speak about it. But that's where, bands like that, Godsmack, Slipknot, and all those started in that time period. So the new millennium comes around. And
we're going to wrap up the I would say volume 1 of
debut albums
with the year 2000. with the return of the metal god Rob Halford.
Rob Halford.
So we got the Resurrection, which is exactly what it was. And so prior to the return as Halford, after Rob left Judas Priest, you had Fight. And
Amazing
Fight,
album. Awesome.
The debut album.
Incredible.
Second album wasn't as strong because some of the pieces had shifted around. Russ Parrish was no longer with the band. It just wasn't as cohesive as an album, and that was really showed with the dissolution of the band afterwards.
Yeah, the songwriting was a little weaker than from the first album. War
Fight
Words.
just smacked you in the face. I mean, it had a grunge aspect to it, but it was also a metal album.
Oh, it was so much, because remember that buzzsaw sound that Metallica had on Kill 'Em All. That was the sound the guitars had on Fight.
It just smacked you right in the face.
And straight up with the Into the Pit on that first song on the album was, talk about getting slapped in the face.
Oh yeah. And then Rob followed up Fight with a project called 2, which was an industrial, like, kind of Nine Inch Nails-y thing that not
Just
many people really liked.
It was just not good.
But he came back with Halford, Resurrection, and just, again, smacked you right in the face with metal. And it was a kind of a realignment onto what he was doing with Judas Priest before he left with Painkiller.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, he followed up with the live Insurrection. Threw in some new songs even on the live album.
Yeah.
So it was a good start back into the new millennium of metal.
Yes, the new millennium of metal. What's amazing about the era now is that there are so many different subgenres.
Oh yeah.
And now, more so than any other time in the history of metal, do they mix.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very rare that you're going to get someone who wants to stay away from another part of the scene. So even like hair metal bands, what they call them now, they still some play with harder bands because everyone
do,
likes
but
it.
there is a lot of divisiveness in the metal community. I mean, there's a lot of people that want nothing to do with other genres of music.
Well, I mean,
it's more on the fan level than on the musician level. But it's completely true. You look at any metal forum, any the Facebook pages that are about metal, and it'll one comment will divide the whole fan base.
But I think that's like that for anything, because it's just a matter. You make one comment, and look at Metallica. Metallica themselves will divide any group of people between
the first 4 albums.
The first
and
4
everything
albums,
after.
the Load era, or now. But what I was trying to say about it was that nowadays you're going to be able to still get a Megadeth playing with a Killswitch Engage, or an Anthrax
sometimes,
playing with Killswitch Engage.
But we saw firsthand with Iron Maiden the last couple of tours that I saw. We saw Raven Age, which opened up for Iron Maiden, which was Steve Harris's son.
Yeah.
And some of the crowd was into it, and a lot of the crowd wasn't, because it's just a very different sound. And you could hear people going, okay, well, a few songs in, they were going, this isn't bad. I like this. But they just didn't know who they were. And
I think that's the big part of the problem, because Ghost had actually a pretty decent showing when they opened up for Maiden in the previous tour.
Yeah, but Ghost has had more publicity,
right?
And a lot of metal people saying, and I mean, when I say metal people, I mean metal bands giving them props for what they do.
Right.
Whereas when Coheed and Cambria opened for Iron Maiden,
they got booed off the stage.
They got booed off the stage. I mean, it's just too different of an experience for a lot of the older fans.
Iron Maiden's a tough crowd, because literally Iron Maiden has their own crowd that shows up to the show, and nobody in that crowd wants to hear anybody else but Maiden.
But I've had other similar experiences. I mean, I went to see Death Clock, Brendan Small project, the Metalocalypse TV show. I went to see the band play live. The opening acts were Machine Head and Overkill, and it was almost like there were people that were just there to see Overkill and they left. And then a younger crowd walks in right when Overkill is leaving
To watch Machine Head?
to watch to watch Death Clock at the end. It was a really bizarre experience because my friend and I are standing there just watching the band, and we're seeing like the crowd cycle in and out, and maybe not necessarily leaving, but heading towards the back, not standing right at the front whenever, or guys that were in the back coming to the front whenever Overkill left the stage, and it was just a really odd experience.
I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. I mean, I went to see Anthrax and Lamb of God, and I stayed for about 3 Lamb of God songs and bailed. Mm-hmm. I like some songs from Lamb of God, but they're almost, the vocals to me, it reminds me of really bad punk, California punk, where you can't understand what they're saying, but the music is awesome, but I just can't deal with the singing. But
it illustrates my point.
Right,
that
exactly.
The metal community is divided.
True, and you're right.
And a lot of times, I mean, like for instance, with me, I've never grown up really listening to a lot of the operatic singing, other than Iron Maiden and some of that vein, which is a little bit more accessible to me than, say, Queensryche, where you've introduced me to Queensryche, and I've come to kind of accept some of that, and I'm getting used to the vocals. So there's opportunities, and I definitely recommend to anybody out there, go see live music. Even if you don't think you like the band, sometimes seeing them live will open up your eyes, open up your ears.
For sure. That's where we're at now.
Well, let's mention one more band from 2000, and that's a really interesting one. Is Fozzy. Now Fozzy, Chris Jericho,
wrestler.
Everybody knows Chris Jericho, right? Chris Jericho, wrestler, dreams of being a metal guy, makes his dream happen. Puts out an album that is really a cover album with 2 original songs on it, under the gimmick that Fozzy's been overseas in Japan for all these years, traveling around, wrote all these amazing songs, and they got ripped off. Well, it's all of our favorite bands, Ozzy,
Judas
Priest, Dio. All these guys have been ripping them off for years. And that was the gimmick for the first 2 albums. But then they changed, and they've been writing original stuff since that is just phenomenal and very accessible. And the first Fozzy album doesn't necessarily represent what they do now, but you can hear how amazing of a singer.
Oh, he's a great singer. I like Fozzy a lot. I love the covers that they do.
Livewire was a great cover.
But
Stand Up and Shout.
The new albums that they've put out, I mean, they're a victim of today's sound in that regards.
Yes.
But the songs are good. I mean, the producer that they have that helps them write their songs they've got some good stuff out there. But definitely have come a long way since the turn of the millennia. You know, and so that's where we're going to end it tonight with for our debut albums. Volume 1, we're going to come back at another time and continue with some more stuff from the 2000s and on.
And now it's time for the Big 4. And we're going to start it off with the subject we were just talking about, our Big 4 debut albums.
All right, so my number 4 debut album of all time is Blizzard of Oz from Ozzy Osbourne.
Oh, what a coincidence. I actually listed Blizzard of Oz as my number 4.
Wow.
Now, why did you pick Blizzard of Oz?
Different genres of metal that came before. He was part of the original heavy metal, and then he comes out, and again, 1980, things were changing, and the scene was changing. He unleashes Blizzard of Oz. It was just phenomenal. I can't say enough about that album and all the 4 albums.
Yeah, I think to me, I mean, he had a lot to prove. You got Black Sabbath continuing on with Ronnie James Dio with Heaven and Hell, and that was such an amazing album of its own right. Breathed life back into Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath had released 6 just stellar albums, and then 2 that had hit or miss. Especially the last one. It just, you could tell everything that was going on at the time in their personal lives was affecting that album. And for them to come back with Heaven and Hell was just eye-opening. But then you have Ozzy come back with with Blizzard of Oz, almost starting fresh. He
Right.
didn't have that groundwork. He didn't have the people he was working with before. And you get the introduction to Randy Rhoads to the world, and enough said.
Right.
There's no misses on that album. It's all hits. All right, for number 3, I got Van Halen's debut album. And keep in mind, we're not looking at each other's lists.
Yeah, no, we're not. And I don't even know which one's my number 3.
You got to pick something.
Well, I know. I like the Van Halen choice because it definitely broke the walls down as far as guitar players. I mean, they didn't know what to do with themselves. I mean, it was just like, what? I mean, to the point where Eddie Van Halen, Dave told him, don't face the crowd so people can't see what you're doing. I mean, that's how unique and special what he was playing and doing was at the time. My number 3 is going to be Appetite for Destruction from Guns N' Roses.
Also a good choice.
That one, obviously, we spoke a lot about it tonight. From Welcome to the Jungle all the way to Rocket Queen, that album, 12 songs strong.
Oh, yeah.
No doubt. What's your next one?
Number 2, I picked Metallica, Kill 'Em All.
Wow. That's coincidental. That's my number 2.
For real? Wow. So Kill 'Em All is my number 2 because it was the purveyor of everything that would be my favorite. I mean, I would love to pick Death as my my favorite debut album, but everything that came after for a band like them far exceeded what they were doing on the first album. There's so many bands like that. Megadeth. I love everything that came after, but Killing Is My Business wasn't their strongest album. There's just so many examples of that. That's why I'm so excited to talk about the sophomore albums in the future, because to me, there's so many. Yeah, you always hear the sophomore slump, but there's so many great sophomore albums from metal bands.
There's so many where the slump didn't happen.
Yeah. So definitely Metallica, Kill 'Em All, the origins of thrash metal. Yes, hell yes.
For sure. All right, so my number 1 is probably, I would almost think it's probably going to be your number 1. I'm not sure. But I have to put it because it was the number 1. It was Black Sabbath.
And that's my number 1.
There you go.
There's not a lot of debate in this particular debate.
But in this segment, it's not necessarily about the debate, but the end result. It's going to be hard to argue about Black Sabbath being the number 1 debut album because it is literally what started it all.
It is. All the points that we made earlier with it being just a creepy album, especially when you put yourself in the context of 1970, Ozzy's young voice,
that was haunting.
The bass,
that song Black Sabbath, that's what that is. It's haunting. If you want to get the willy scared out of you, listen to that song in the dark.
Well, that's exactly what.
And
I
listen
did,
to it when it's raining, because then you think it's really raining. It's weird. Mm-hmm. That song is so weird. That's another reason why I don't like it.
You have the intro to NIB. You've got
that's killer intro. That basically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've got Evil Woman. You've got the Wizard.
The Wizard is my favorite Black Sabbath song.
A lot of bluesy stuff, but with that influence of that tone, just made all the world of difference, and put them in a whole different genre that left people wondering what they were doing for the next 20 years.
I mean, think about the influence that album has had on everybody. I mean, all from Metallica to Soundgarden, all these people that Sepultura, Slayer, they all cite Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath as their guitar hero and their band.
The riff master.
Yeah. The riff master, for sure. So that is it. So number 4 for both of us was Blizzard of Oz.
Got a little bit. So here's what I think. We got to leave the order of 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. We got Black Sabbath number 1, Metallica, Kill 'Em All number 2. We both picked Blizzard of Oz. It's got to be number 3.
Okay, I'll go with that.
So Blizzard of Oz. So the question is Van Halen with the original album, or Appetite for Destruction with Guns N' Roses? Which is the more influential? Which is the better of the 2 albums?
If you're going to go a pure influence, it would have to be Van Halen.
Okay.
But if you're going to talk about across the board appeal, I would go with Appetite.
And I would venture to agree with you in some regard to Appetite, because you think about it, when people say Van Halen, what's the album that most people would say is their best album? It's kind of a toss-up, but a lot of people still think 1984.
Yeah, they're going to go to Jump or
Jump with
or How for Teacher. I mean, that's where they were mainstream in America.
Whereas Guns N' Roses is still known for Appetite.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows Welcome to the Jungle. Everyone knows Sweet Child of Mine.
I think I might be willing to concede this one and say Guns N' Roses Appetite as number 4.
Number 4. Okay, so the big 4 debut albums, as compiled by the Dean of Metal and Chris Kaye, is number 4, Appetite for Destruction. Number 3, Blizzard of Oz from Ozzy Osbourne. Number 2, Metallica's Kill 'Em All. And number 1, the grandfathers, the godfathers of metal, Black Sabbath, with their debut album, Black Sabbath.
All right. Well, that's it for Debating Metal. On behalf of myself and Kenneth Dean, if you enjoyed our podcast or just want to rip our opinions a new one, you follow us at facebook.com/debatingmetalpodcast or Instagram at debatingmetal. And you can also follow us on Podbeam.